It was the peculiar sort of morning that Silver Manor had grown accustomed to, quiet, serene, and bathed in a light fog that clung to the dewy grass like a secret. The sprawling estate was a reflection of its owner, Sir Charles Middleton, proud, ancient, and seemingly untouched by the modern world. There was a sense of timelessness in the air, a place where the hours passed languidly, and the bustle of the outside world was nothing more than a whisper on the wind. Yet, as the events of that morning would soon prove, even the most serene of places can hide the darkest of mysteries. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, had been invited to the manor for the weekend, though my presence was, I confess, more out of habit than necessity. Sir Charles was a collector of rare antiquities, particularly coins, and though I found the subject intriguing, I was far more interested in the hospitality offered by the Middleton household than in any numismatic conversations. I arrived early, well before the others, for Sir Charles was an early riser, and I had planned to accompany him on one of his many excursions into his study to view his latest acquisitions. But as fate would have it, the day began far differently than I expected. It was Mrs. Griffiths, the housekeeper, who found him. I remember her voice, strained and shaking, as she entered the drawing-room where I had been reading the morning paper. Sir Charles is dead. At first, I had assumed she was mistaken. Perhaps he had simply fainted or taken ill. But when I accompanied her to his study, the sight of Sir Charles Middleton's lifeless form, slumped over his desk, told a different story altogether. The great man was gone. I must admit, my first instinct was to turn away, to seek out some explanation. But as I stood there, I could not help but notice the strange stillness of the room. Everything was in its place. The polished mahogany furniture, the scattered books, the faint smell of leather and tobacco smoke in the air. But it was the way Sir Charles had fallen that struck me most. His left hand, now cold and stiff, was clenched tightly around something small and metallic, a coin. It was not unusual for Sir Charles to have a coin or two near him, as he spent hours each week cataloguing his vast collection. But this was different. This coin was unfamiliar to me, an old, tarnished piece, its design worn smooth by years of handling. It looked almost ancient, its surface marred by age, yet it held an undeniable weight, both in substance and significance. The manner of his death was not immediately apparent. There were no signs of violence, no obvious wounds, no indications of foul play. His body was as it might have been after a peaceful night's rest, save for the tightness in his hand and the presence of that strange coin. The room, however, was not without its mysteries. Mrs. Griffiths explained that she had found Sir Charles exactly where he always sat, at his desk, but no one had heard a sound. The house was unusually quiet that morning. No one had disturbed him, she insisted, and yet something about the scene seemed off, as though the death itself had arrived with a silent, undetected step. By then, I had already begun to form the smallest of suspicions. It was Poirot, of course, who would be the one to clear away the fog of uncertainty. His methods, precise, logical, and often marked by a certain flair, had never failed him in the past, and I knew that he would be the one to untangle the mystery of Sir Charles's death. And so it was no surprise that later that afternoon, Hercule Poirot himself arrived at Silver Manor. He entered the drawing-room with the same immaculate composure I had come to know so well. His crisp suit, always perfectly tailored, seemed almost to radiate an aura of order. His small, precise steps echoed in the hallway as he made his way towards the study, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the air of a man whose mind was already at work. "You have called me, Hastings, and I shall not disappoint," Poirot said, his voice calm, as he surveyed the room. His eyes, sharp as ever, settled immediately on the body of Sir Charles Middleton, his gaze never wavering. "It seems a natural death, Poirot," I ventured, though even as I spoke I knew my words carried little weight.
I was not the one who had the gift of seeing what lay beneath the surface. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his lips curling slightly. "Ah, mon ami, you are not one for mysteries, are you? You see, it is not always the obvious that tells the story with—"
A soft sigh, Poirot stepped closer to Sir Charles's desk, examining the scene with meticulous care. His fingers brushed lightly against the surface of the coin that still clung to the deceased's hand. He did not move it, but studied it with the intensity of a man staring into the heart of a puzzle. "Interesting," Poirot muttered to himself, more to the room than to me. "This coin, it is no ordinary piece. It is, how shall I say, a rare specimen indeed. Rare, yes, but its significance is not in its value alone." I leaned in to see what he meant. He gently nudged the coin with his fingertips, turning it just slightly so I could see it from another angle. There, faintly etched upon the surface, was a symbol, the crest of a long-forgotten noble family. A family that had once been involved in a scandal, one that had tarnished their reputation, and whose heir had vanished under mysterious circumstances many years ago. Could this coin have any connection to that long-buried past? Poirot's eyes gleamed as he surveyed the room once again. "A coin, my friend, is not simply a coin. No, no, it is a key. A key to understanding a great many things." His words hung in the air like a riddle I could not solve. I found myself glancing at the others in the room, the staff, the family, all of them looking equally puzzled. Lady Margaret, Sir Charles's widow, was present, as was their son, George Middleton, a man whose face showed the weariness of someone accustomed to managing expectations. Neither of them seemed particularly shaken, though their expressions were strained. Could one of them know more than they let on? As Poirot turned to me with a knowing glance, his expression softened with a hint of pride. "We are just beginning, mon ami. The truth, it will emerge, but slowly, like the fog lifting from the moors." I had no doubt that Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, weaving together threads I could not yet see. But one thing was certain. Sir Charles Middleton's death was far from natural, and this coin, this odd, mysterious coin, would prove to be the key to unlocking the secret that had brought this man to an untimely end. And as Poirot took a step back, his gaze still fixed on the room's many details, I knew that the mystery of Silver Manor had only just begun. The house was silent when Poirot entered the study, as though the very walls held their breath. Mrs. Griffiths, who had seemed so flustered earlier, now stood near the door, her hands wringing in nervous anticipation. I was, admittedly, still trying to make sense of the scene that had unfolded before me. Sir Charles Middleton dead at his desk with that strange coin in his hand. Yet it was Poirot's presence, as calm and deliberate as ever, that shifted the atmosphere in the room. His gaze moved from the body to the rest of the room, taking in every detail with quiet precision. "Mon ami, you are thinking perhaps that it was a natural death?" he asked, his eyes momentarily meeting mine. "That Sir Charles passed away in his sleep, his health failing him at last?" I had no answer for him. I had thought precisely that. The man had been elderly, a lifelong collector who had perhaps at long last succumbed to the burdens of age. But Poirot's expression was unreadable, his lips thin with a barely perceptible smile. "No, no."
"You are mistaken, my friend. The death of Sir Charles was not natural. His death," Poirot paused dramatically, eyes narrowing as he continued to scan the room, "was engineered." I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Engineered? You're—"
"Saying it was—" Poirot held up a hand, silencing me with his usual modest authority.
"Ah, Hastings, your imagination is much too simplistic. It is not a question of murder or some spectacular event. It is the subtleties, the details that elude most, but which I see clearly." He stepped closer to the desk, his hands clasped.
Behind his back as he looked at Sir Charles's lifeless form with renewed scrutiny. "Notice, Hastings," he said, pointing to the coin still tightly grasped in Sir Charles's hand. "This coin, it is important, yes, but why would he have held it so firmly in his final moments? It is not merely a collector's trinket." He bent down, inspecting the edges of the coin under the light, then straightened up again, eyes flicking toward me with an almost imperceptible gleam. "There is meaning in this, but not the meaning that first comes to mind." I had no immediate response, and so I stood there, observing Poirot as he continued to examine the room. His gaze flicked over every corner, every book on the shelves, every piece of furniture, as though the very fabric of the space held some secret. It was a sort of quiet madness in the way Poirot worked. It looked effortless, but I knew it was a system of acute observation that required an immense focus, one that I had never quite mastered. "There is something wrong," Poirot muttered, almost to himself. "The house. It is too quiet, too composed." He turned to me then, his eyes sharp. "Do you not find it strange that no one heard anything? Hastings, no sound of struggle, no commotion. Sir Charles must have been dead for hours by the time you arrived."
And yet the house is calm," I finished for him. Poirot gave a nod, eyes sparkling. "Exactly. It is as though the death was anticipated. No one is startled. No one is shocked." He paused and turned back toward the door,
Catching the gaze of Mrs. Griffiths. "But you, madam, you are disturbed, yes? You are not as composed as you appear." Mrs. Griffiths stiffened, but remained silent. I watched as Poirot's gaze turned to each of the household staff, the butler, the maids, and the cook, all of whom had gathered nearby, their eyes uncertain, but refusing to meet his. "Interesting," Poirot murmured, now addressing the staff, with the faintest trace of a smile. "All of you are being very careful, are you not? As though you are afraid of revealing something, but that is not possible, no? For the truth has a way of slipping out in the most unexpected moments." He turned on his heel and faced the door once more, where Sir Charles's son, George Middleton, stood watching, his arms crossed in a stiff, almost defensive posture. Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and he observed the younger Middleton, with a coolness that I had seen only when he was sizing up a suspect. The son seemed strangely composed for someone whose father had just passed away, his expression unreadable but for the faintest tension around his jaw. "And you, Monsieur Middleton?" Poirot asked softly. "You are concerned, yes? But is it grief you feel, or something else?" George flinched, a barely perceptible movement. Yet his voice, when he spoke, was steady enough, even if tinged with an undertone of irritation. "Perhaps you'll be kind enough to explain that question to me, Poirot, instead of making insinuations." Poirot's eyes twinkled, and I could almost hear the soft chuckle behind his words. "Ah, but monsieur, you misunderstand. I am not accusing you, I am merely pointing out the obvious. You are concerned, but you are also calculating." He tilted his head slightly as though studying George in a new light. Do you not find it odd that you have not been moved to tears, that you seem to have an answer for every question?
Posed. George's face tightened, but he said nothing further. Poirot turned to me then, his gaze almost pitying. Hastings, you see, this is the flaw in your theory. You believe everyone acts in the same way when faced with loss.
But human nature is far more complex than you give it credit for. Some people feel things deeply and yet hide their emotions. Others are stoic, calculating, trying to maintain control over a situation that threatens to spiral out of their grasp. George, I murmured, you mean he's hiding something? Poirot gave me a knowing smile, but said nothing more. Instead, he glanced at the window, his eyes tracking the sun as it dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows in the room. Then, with a soft sigh, he turned back toward the rest of the household. You will all be questioned in due course, he said, his voice even, but with an unmistakable edge. Each of you has something to tell me, even if you do not yet know what it is. But one thing I do know already. Sir Charles did not die by chance. There is a deliberate hand behind this death. I could feel the room tense. Mrs. Griffiths stiffened further. The Middleton family exchanged glances and the staff shifted uncomfortably. Poirot's words had struck a chord, whether they were ready to admit it or not. As Poirot turned his back on the group and began pacing slowly, I found myself once again in the position of being the confused observer, trying to make sense of the puzzle he was already starting to solve. There were clues hidden in the smallest of things, the way George stood, the look that passed between the staff, the strange stillness of the house itself. "Tell me, Hastings," Poirot asked, his voice low and measured, "have you noticed how each of them reacts to my presence, how some are guarded, others defensive, and yet others distant?" I glanced at the faces in the room, now more aware than ever of their emotional contradictions. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The answers are here. They are all here, if you look closely enough." And with that, I knew that the game had begun in earnest. The sitting room at Silver Manor was bathed in the soft light of afternoon, casting long shadows on the antique furniture. Lady Margaret Middleton sat with a composed elegance in the armchair opposite Poirot, her hands delicately folded in her lap. She was a woman in her mid-40s, dark-haired, with a sharp, aristocratic beauty that had not faded with time. I couldn't help but notice the contrast between her outward composure and the subtle tension that seemed to hang in the air. Poirot had already observed her for some moments before he spoke. His gaze was always direct, yet gentle, as if he were about to unravel the fabric of her thoughts with the smallest pull. "Lady Margaret," Poirot began, his voice polite yet probing, "it is clear to me that you are a woman of strength and poise. But of course strength is not the same as indifference, no? You are grieving the loss of your husband, are you not?" The question was simple enough, but it made Lady Margaret flinch for the briefest of moments, a slight tightening of her lips that would have gone unnoticed by anyone but Poirot. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," she replied with a steady, cool voice. "My husband's death is a tragedy. It has been a most trying time for all of us. But I'm afraid I do not understand why this investigation must drag on for so long. Surely his death was of natural causes." Poirot made no immediate reply, merely watching her. His silence seemed to create a slight discomfort in Lady Margaret, and I saw her fingers twitch involuntarily, though she quickly regained her composure. "You are, of course, entitled to your opinion, madame," Poirot said, his tone smooth. "But there are details, little things which suggest otherwise. Sir Charles had a fine constitution, yes? No history of heart trouble, no?" Lady Margaret nodded slowly. None whatsoever. He had a heart of iron, as they say. I would know if his health were failing." She paused, her voice lowering just slightly. He had not complained, not even in the days leading up to his death. "And yet," Poirot pressed, his eyes sharp, "you did not hear him that evening? No sign of distress?" Lady Margaret's gaze faltered for a brief moment. "No," she said a little too quickly. "I was not with him when it happened. I was in my rooms. I didn't hear anything unusual." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "And that is curious, is it not? For a woman so close to her husband to not hear the slightest thing out of the ordinary." Her fingers tightened around the arm of the chair. "I told you, Monsieur Poirot, I was not near him at the time." "Nor, madame, you were not near him. But you were not distressed by the news either," Poirot continued. "Perhaps it is because you already knew. You had already suspected." This, Lady Margaret's eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place. Was it defensiveness, or was it fear? She regained her poise quickly, of course. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly now. "I only know what I was told." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, but that is where we differ, madam. I prefer to know for myself, to examine the key facts before forming conclusions, and one of those facts, the most peculiar, is the coin." Lady Margaret's expression changed immediately. She stiffened, a subtle but unmistakable shift in her demeanour. Her eyes briefly flicked to the desk where Sir Charles's coin had been placed earlier. "It is just a coin," she said, her voice too calm. "I don't see why you were making so much of it. Surely it was a mere trinket he kept for sentimental reasons." Poirot smiled faintly, his lips curling in a way I had come to recognize as his form of quiet amusement. "Ah, but that is the point, madam. A trinket? A coin held so tightly in his hand. Does it seem like the gesture of a man who has died peacefully in his sleep?" He paused, allowing the silence to hang heavy between them. No, this is not a simple matter. This coin is not merely decorative. It has meaning. The question is, what meaning?" Lady Margaret shifted in her chair, and for the first time she seemed at a loss. She hesitated before replying, her voice quiet. "Perhaps it is a simple thing, something he took comfort in. I don't know why you are making such an issue out of it." Poirot raised a finger, a gesture I had come to recognize as the beginning of a new line of thought. "Ah, but you see, madame, you are lying to me, not
intentionally, I think. No, you are merely avoiding the truth, perhaps because you fear it. Perhaps you know far more than you care to admit." Lady Margaret swallowed hard, and I watched her face blanch ever so slightly. She recovered herself quickly, though. "And when—"
She spoke again. Her voice was noticeably colder. "I have told you everything I know. If you have finished with me, Monsieur Poirot, I must return to my duties." Poirot did not press further. Instead, he stood, his movements slow but deliberate, his eyes never leaving Lady Margaret. "Very well, madame, but remember the truth. She is like the tide. She will come in sooner or later." As Lady Margaret stood, her face carefully neutral once more, I could sense the unease she had attempted to conceal. The tension in the room had shifted, but I was still unsure whether I had witnessed a guilty woman or merely a distraught widow. Poirot, of course, seemed to know exactly what he was thinking, but he gave nothing away. "Lady Margaret, perhaps? You will help me with one last question," Poirot said smoothly, before she could exit the room. "You mentioned earlier that your husband had no history of heart trouble. Tell me then, did he have any unusual behavior in the weeks before his death? Perhaps something he said, something you noticed?" Lady Margaret hesitated for a moment, her back still to him, and then slowly she turned. No, Monsieur Poirot, there was nothing. Poirot nodded, seemingly satisfied, though his eyes glittered with the knowledge that her answer wasn't as convincing as she hoped. He turned to me as she left the room, his face unreadable. "It is most interesting, Hastings," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Lady Margaret, so composed, so careful. But there is something hidden beneath the surface. She speaks of nothing unusual, yet her discomfort, it speaks volumes. I could not help but ask, "Do you think she knows something about the coin?" Poirot's lips curled again. "That, mon ami, is a question I will answer soon enough. For now—"
"However, let us not forget the words of the butler." I blinked, confused. "The butler?"
"Yes, Hastings," Poirot continued. "I believe he has offered us our first red herring. Did you not hear him mention Sir Charles's secretive behaviour in the days before his death? But surely he was merely—" I started to say. Poirot raised a hand, silencing me. "No, no, it is a small detail, but one we must remember, a clue perhaps, or a piece of a larger puzzle. We shall see." And with that, the investigation continued its quiet, relentless advance, each step unfolding the intricate web of secrets and lies that tied the inhabitants of Silver Manor to Sir Charles's death. I could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, but where they would land I could not yet say. The evening had settled over Silver Manor like a heavy velvet curtain, its thick silence almost oppressive. Poirot had been unusually quiet during dinner, his mind clearly engaged in some deeper thought. As we retired to the drawing-room for a brandy, I noticed that his eyes, ever sharp, remained fixed on the small object we had all overlooked. The coin. It had been placed with great care on the corner of the desk in the study, the same place where Sir Charles's body had been found. The coin had been, of course, the central point of Poirot's investigation. He had spoken little of it directly, but I knew that his mind was focused on its significance. It was as though, without the coin, the case would remain unsolved. Without it, the mystery would not cohere. Poirot leaned back in his chair, swirling the brandy in his glass, his eyes distant as he let the liquid catch the light. "Hastings, you have an interest in history, yes? Specifically in antiquities?" "History, yes," I replied, leaning forward slightly, though I confess I do not claim any particular expertise in numismatics. Poirot's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "And yet it is numismatics that will explain much of what we see here." He placed his glass down gently and turned to the desk. "The coin, Hastings. That is where the answer lies." I followed his gaze, my thoughts still distracted by the events of the day. "What do you mean? Surely it's just an old coin." "An oddity, yes, but not a motive for murder." Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the object, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, but you see, mon ami, this coin is not just any coin. It is a rare piece, an artifact with a history of its own. One that was lost to time, hidden away, until now." I felt a sense of unease settle in my chest. "A lost treasure, then?" "Yes," Poirot confirmed, his voice low but filled with certainty. "This coin once belonged to no less than the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. It was part of a limited series struck in the early 1800s, known only to a few collectors. Its value, monetary and historical, is incalculable." I blinked, taken aback by the gravity of the revelation. "Napoleon? That's extraordinary, but what does that have to do with Sir Charles's death?" Poirot allowed the question to hang in the air for a moment before answering, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "Sir Charles was, you see, A collector of rare coins, one of the most distinguished in Europe. His collection was the envy of many, and this particular coin, the Bonaparte piece, had been his white whale, the one treasure he could not acquire. I was beginning to see the shape of the mystery taking form, but something still felt out of place. But if Sir Charles had such a collection, surely he'd have known the value of this coin. Exactly, Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. And yet it was not displayed as a part of his collection, but rather hidden, a sign of something more than mere possession. There was a moment of silence as Poirot allowed the weight of his words to settle between us. It was as though 1,000 implications hung in the air, invisible but undeniable. Poirot, I said carefully, are you suggesting this coin might have been stolen, that someone killed Sir Charles in a botched robbery? Poirot gave a slight shake of his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. No, Hastings, that would be too simple, too obvious. There is something more complicated at work here. If this coin had been the motive for murder, we would have seen a far more chaotic scene. No, this was planned. It was never about the coin itself. It is about what the coin represents. I furrowed my brow. What do you mean? A symbol?
Of power? Wealth? A link to history? Poirot nodded slowly, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the arm of his chair. Ah, but there is something else, something more personal. You see, Sir Charles's obsession with his collection
was well known. He spent years searching for rare pieces, bidding on auctions, sometimes at great cost. There were rumours, Hastings, rumours of his dealings with less reputable individuals. I wonder if some of them knew the true worth of this coin, not merely in terms of money, but as a key to a much darker chapter of history. I stared at the coin, now placed beneath Poirot's keen gaze, and suddenly I saw the complexity in the case I had missed before. This was not just a collector's pursuit, it was a dangerous game, one that might have involved more than just a thief. As I turned over the idea in my mind, Poirot's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. And then there is the matter of the small detail, the one that everyone else has overlooked. I turned quickly to face him. What detail? Poirot's eyes gleamed as he pointed to the coin on the desk. Observe it carefully, Hastings. There is a slight indentation on the edge, almost imperceptible. It appears to be the result of a blow, a small but significant injury to the coin. I leaned forward, my own eyes narrowing as I studied it closely. Sure enough, a barely visible dent marred the smooth, polished surface of the coin. It was subtle, almost too faint to notice unless one knew exactly what to look for. And what does that tell you? I asked, my voice low with curiosity. Poirot's lips curled into a satisfied smile. It tells me that the coin was not merely placed in Sir Charles's hand, it was forced there. It was a final, deliberate act, a message, if you will. A message? I repeated, my thoughts racing. Who would have done such a thing?
Why? Poirot's eyes shone with the clarity of someone who had already pieced together more than he was willing to reveal. I do not yet know, Hastings, but this coin, this rare treasure, was meant to be found. Its discovery, its placement
in Sir Charles's hand, it was deliberate, and in that simple gesture it holds the answer. The implications were slowly beginning to unfurl, but there was still so much left to understand. What had happened between Sir Charles and those who had known of this coin's existence? Was this simply the result of an obsessive collector's greed, or was there a deeper, more personal motive at play? Poirot turned to me then, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. one that I knew meant he was contemplating something far beyond what had been spoken aloud. Perhaps, Hastings,
We have been looking at this all wrong.
perhaps Sir Charles's death was not a robbery gone awry. No, I think it is far more calculated than that. The evening wore on, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift, thickening with the presence of a single, looming question. Who among them would go so far for something as seemingly small as a coin? What were they willing to sacrifice to claim it for themselves? As Poirot remained lost in thought, I couldn't help but feel that the next step in our investigation would reveal an unexpected and dangerous truth. But which of the suspects had the most to gain? The answer, Poirot seemed to be suggesting, was just beyond our reach, waiting to be uncovered in the smallest of details. The next day dawned dreary and grey, a fitting reflection of the atmosphere in Silver Manor. Poirot was, as always, methodical in his approach, and it was clear to me that he was narrowing his focus on the Middleton family. We had spoken little of the coin since our last discussion, but its importance lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. After a quiet breakfast, Poirot wasted no time in arranging the next round of interviews. This time it was George Middleton, the heir apparent, who would be first. His demeanour had been aloof when I had briefly spoken with him earlier, and I knew that Poirot would press him as gently as a vice, all the while allowing the tension to build in a way that would force him to slip. I had not yet made up my mind about George. His demeanour was polished, but there was something about his manner that suggested an edge to his personality, a sharpness that seemed at odds with the calm and collected exterior. He was, in a word, a man on the cusp of great change, a man with much to gain. When George entered the room, I immediately noted the strained air between him and Poirot. The younger man carried himself with the haughty air of someone who believed their inheritance to be an inalienable right, though I could sense the undercurrent of irritation that ran through his posture. He was hardly as gracious as his mother had been, and his eyes flickered uneasily from Poirot's gaze. Poirot wasted no time in addressing the matter at hand. "Monsieur Middleton," he said, his voice measured and calm, "we are investigating the tragic death of your father. I trust you understand the necessity of my questions." George's lips curled into a tight smile, one that barely reached his eyes. "Of course, Mr. Poirot. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. A death in the family, especially so sudden. But I assure you there is no mystery
Here, my father's health had been deteriorating for years. His passing was not unnatural. And yet, Poirot interjected smoothly, the manner of his passing suggests otherwise. His hand clenched about the coin, a strange gesture for
someone with a heart attack, would you not agree?" George's eyes flickered just for a moment, but Poirot caught it. "I don't see why that matters," he said dismissively, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "The coin was merely something my father treasured. He had a penchant for collecting, and that coin was one of his prized possessions. It's not so unusual that he would keep it near him, even in his final moments." Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Perhaps. But why would your father choose to hold the coin in his last moments, George? Was it not a symbol of something else, something that may have been stolen?" For the first time I saw a flicker of genuine unease cross George's face. His hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered, though there was an edge to his voice that betrayed him. "My father was old. He was ill. People do strange things in their last moments. You can't attach significance to everything, Mr. Poirot." Poirot's gaze held George's firmly. "Ah, but I must, mon ami. I must." There was an uncomfortable silence in the room before George stood abruptly, his chair scraping sharply against the floor. "I think I've answered enough questions for now," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "If you need anything more, you'll find me in the library." As George left the room, I couldn't help but notice the way his face had tightened, his jaw set as though bracing against some unseen storm. Poirot, on the other hand, remained composed, his expression unreadable. "Quite the performance, don't you think, Hastings?" he murmured, as George's footsteps faded down. "The hallway. I suppose you don't believe him?" I asked, though it was clear from Poirot's silence that he was already dissecting every word George had uttered. "Non," Poirot replied, his voice low and thoughtful. There is something in the way George reacted to the coin, to the question
of it being stolen. It is not merely dismissive, it is defensive. He has much to lose, you see, and much to hide.
I nodded slowly, my mind turning over the details. But does he have a reason to kill his father? Poirot's gaze drifted toward the window, as though looking out at the murky horizon. That, my dear Hastings, is what we must discover. Later, that afternoon, Poirot turned his attention to the family doctor, Dr. Watson, who had been treating Sir Charles for some time. Dr. Watson was an older man, mild-mannered and somewhat unassuming, but I had noticed that he was careful with his
words.
During our brief exchanges, he had not seemed inclined to offer much information unless directly asked. Poirot was keen to press him on the matter of Sir Charles's health, suspecting there was more to the story than the standard reports indicated. Dr. Watson was not easily rattled, but I could see the tension in his posture as Poirot asked about the general condition of Sir Charles before his death. "Well, Sir Charles had been in poor health for some time," Dr. Watson began, his voice steady. "His heart had been a concern for several years, and I had advised him on several occasions to take it easy. But he was stubborn. A man of his age, well, you know how it is." Poirot's eyes were sharp as he observed the doctor's every movement, every slight pause. "And yet you would not consider his death entirely natural, would you?" The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering, a slight furrow creasing his brow. "I suppose not. There were anomalies. Small things, it's difficult to explain, but there were signs that his condition might not have been as straightforward as I had believed." Poirot leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What sort of anomalies?" Dr. Watson's gaze shifted uneasily. Well, Sir Charles had been exhibiting some strange behaviours recently, things that didn't quite fit with his usual condition. He was more agitated, more paranoid, and he mentioned a family secret on more than one occasion. He was worried about something he refused to elaborate on. Poirot's eyes sharpened at this revelation. "A family secret? What do you mean?" The doctor looked around the room as though searching for a way to back out of the conversation. "I
don't know the full details. I only know what he told me. He mentioned something about his son George."
I don't know what it was, but Sir Charles seemed convinced that George was hiding something from him. He said something about a mistake of the past, but at that moment the door to the study creaked open, and Dr. Watson faltered, his face turning pale. Poirot's eyes flickered toward the door, but before either of us could speak further, the moment was lost. As Dr. Watson clammed up, I could sense Poirot's growing resolve. Something was amiss, and the conversation with the doctor had opened up more questions than it had answered. What was the family secret Sir Charles had alluded to? What mistake had George made in the past that was so troubling to his father? And how, I wondered, did this all tie into the murder? Poirot, ever so composed, seemed to have already formed an opinion. He did not speak as we left the study, but his eyes were alight with the fire of an investigator who was drawing closer to the truth. The investigation had settled into a rhythm now, the heavy silence of Silver Manor punctuated only by the soft murmur of Poirot's observations. His questions, though precise, were a quiet tension that hung in the air, not yet forcing the family to crack, but encouraging them to edge closer to their own unravelling. It was clear that the Middletons had more to hide than I had initially assumed. Our next lead came unexpectedly, a discovery tucked away in Sir Charles's personal study. We had combed through his belongings earlier, but Poirot's methodical search never rested. A letter found amongst a stack of other papers seemed out of place, a recent communication that had been carelessly left unfiled. It was a business letter, or so it appeared at first glance, though its contents were cryptic enough to raise alarms. Poirot had noticed it immediately, his trained eye picking up the slight disarray on Sir Charles's desk. He didn't miss much. I had been with him when he opened the envelope, his fingers quick, his eyes sharp, and the first few words had a peculiar weight to them. To Sir Charles Middleton, I trust you will settle the matter swiftly. There are consequences for delays. Poirot read it through once, then again. The letter was unsigned, the ink a deep, urgent black, and the phrasing oddly cold, far too businesslike for any personal correspondence. As I watched, Poirot's face remained unreadable, his brows furrowed just slightly in concentration. He paused, folding the letter back carefully, as if it might vanish into thin air if he handled it too roughly.
An unsigned letter, Hastings. It speaks of consequences. A deal gone awry, perhaps. I could hear the intrigue in his voice, yet there was no rush in his actions. Poirot did not jump to conclusions, but his mind was already turning, circling
the possible interpretations. The contents of the letter could easily be dismissed as nothing more than a vague threat, an ill-placed warning about an unfulfilled agreement. But Poirot, as always, was not one to take things at face value. Who could have sent this? I asked, though I already felt the answer was as elusive as the letter itself. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a quiet certainty. That, mon ami, is what we must discover. But this is a new layer to our puzzle. We must not ignore it. We spent the next few hours sifting through Sir Charles's financial records, searching for any link to the mysterious letter, but found nothing immediately conclusive. Still, the mention of consequences lingered in my mind. A business deal gone wrong, Poirot had said. Was it a simple financial dispute, or was there something deeper? A hidden enmity, or a desperate person willing to go to extreme measures to cover up their failures? When we reconvened in the drawing room, the Middleton family seemed more fractured than before. George had retreated into the library as if determined to avoid further questioning, and Lady Margaret seemed a touch more discomposed than I had noticed previously. Her interactions with Poirot were becoming less cordial and more cautious, her answers, though polite, increasingly hesitant. I couldn't help but notice that when Poirot casually mentioned the letter, her composure faltered for a split second. It was as though some unspoken connection had passed through her eyes, though she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "There is nothing of importance in that letter, Mr. Poirot," Lady Margaret said, her voice still refined, but there was an edge to it now. "I do not see how it pertains to the investigation of my husband's death." Poirot's gaze did not leave her. "It may not, madame, but there are many things in life that appear trivial, only to reveal themselves as keys to greater mysteries." I caught the briefest flicker of discomfort in Lady Margaret's eyes. For a moment she looked as though she might speak, but she quickly regained control. "I told you before, Mr. Poirot," she said, with a soft laugh, though it sounded slightly strained. "My husband's passing was a result of his failing health. There are no mysteries here." Poirot, ever the master of subtlety, allowed the silence to hang between them. He did not press her further on the letter, though I could see that he was storing this moment away, adding another piece to his mental puzzle. I, however, was not so restrained. As soon as Poirot and I were alone again, I turned to him. "Lady Margaret knows something about that letter, doesn't she?" Poirot's expression remained placid, though a flicker of approval passed across his features. "Perhaps, Hastings. But one must be cautious in making assumptions. You see, we are at a crossroads. The letter could be a key, but it could also be a red herring, a deliberate attempt to mislead." I frowned. "A red herring?"
But it doesn't seem to fit the pattern of the other clues. This seems genuine, doesn't it? Poirot's lips twitched.
"Ah, Hastings, one can never be too sure. There is often an art to misdirection, is there not? A piece of information that looks true, that feels true, but in reality it is planted to pull us away from the truth. Think of it. If Sir Charles were indeed involved in some financial misdeed, perhaps a dangerous one, who would benefit from his death? The thought hung in the air, a question that begged an answer. Would it be George? Was the letter an indication that Sir Charles had
made enemies in business? It would explain the cold, distant nature of the letter and the suggestion of consequences.
But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew about Sir Charles's dealings beyond his numismatic passion. Poirot continued, his voice thoughtful. "Consider also the timing, Hastings. A letter sent at a crucial moment, with no signature, no direct trace, intended to place doubt, to make one look in all the wrong directions."
It is not a coincidence that this letter came to light now. I watched as Poirot's mind worked, the wheels turning behind his steady gaze. But it could be the very thing that was designed to pull our focus. And thus, we must be wary of overvaluing it. As Poirot spoke, I felt a sharp discomfort settle in my chest.
The mystery was indeed deepening, but each step forward seemed to be leading us into a maze of confusion and false leads. Could the letter be linked to Sir Charles's death, or was it merely a distraction from the real killer? The tension in the manor was palpable. In each conversation I could see cracks beginning to form in the Middleton family's facade, and each new revelation pushed us closer to the heart of the mystery. But with every step, Poirot seemed even more certain of his course, his mind calculating, unraveling the threads with precision. Still, I could not shake the feeling that we were edging dangerously close to a trap, one set by the very people we were investigating. As Poirot and I retired to our rooms for the night, I couldn't help but wonder, were we on the right track, or were we walking into a carefully laid trap designed to lead us astray? The answer, I knew, would come soon enough. But for now, the mystery of the letter and its possible connection to the murder remained just out of reach, and Lady Margaret's reaction to it, I feared, might be the key that unlocked everything. The air in Silver Manor had grown thick with secrets, each conversation, each discovery revealing less and less, even as Poirot's search for the truth seemed to close in on something unmistakable. We had spent days carefully tracking each lead, every clue meticulously examined under Poirot's watchful gaze, and yet, with each passing hour, I could not shake the sensation that we were still circling, never quite reaching the heart of the
matter. It was the discovery of the journal that seemed to change everything. Poirot, ever meticulous, had begun to sift through the personal papers of Sir Charles in search of any clue that might connect the deceased to the growing list of possible motives.
It was in a dust-covered, leather-bound journal that he found something rather unexpected, an obscure reference to a past mistake involving a coin. The words were cryptic, a mere fleeting mention on the second-to-last page of the journal, tucked between mundane financial notes and scribbled thoughts on numismatic matters. The mention was curious enough for Poirot to ask for the journal's history. He knew Sir Charles had a passion for coins, but this particular entry seemed to hold a significance that had nothing to do with numismatics. Instead, it alluded to a debt, a misplaced judgment that Sir Charles had failed to settle, and there was a suggestion that this mistake had long-lasting consequences. The coin in question, it seemed, was a rare artifact, one that had once been lost in a gambling debt and recovered only years later, though never discussed again. Poirot's eyes had narrowed when he read this part, and he quietly folded the journal closed, looking as though he was piecing together a puzzle that I could not yet see. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" I had asked, though I could already sense he wasn't quite ready to offer an explanation. "An enigma, Hastings," he said simply. "There is something here, but not yet the full picture. This coin, this mistake, it is not merely a trinket in the hands of a collector.
No, it is a key. But whose key is it?" I glanced at the words again, a vague unease settling in my stomach. Could this coin hold the key to Sir Charles's death? And if so, what was the mistake Sir Charles had made that was tied to it? But as
the day wore on, another puzzle surfaced, one that for the moment seemed far more immediate and alarming. The butler, who had long seemed nothing more than a quiet, somewhat invisible presence in the household, came under suspicion. It was not so much his actions that alerted Poirot, but rather an unusual reaction during an innocuous conversation. I had always thought of Thomas, the butler, as the type who silently hovered on the periphery, tending to his duties with little more than the occasional polite nod. His demeanour was faultless, his responses well measured. Yet, as Poirot began to question him about Sir Charles's final days, a subtle unease crept into the butler's responses. His usual steady gaze flickered for just a moment when Poirot casually mentioned the idea of investigating the staff. Thomas had claimed to know nothing of the deceased's dealings, had seen nothing unusual in Sir Charles's habits, but his reactions, brief flashes of discomfort, seemed telling, even if Poirot had not yet spoken a word. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that quiet, penetrating interest. "Hastings, do you notice anything peculiar about our butler?" I had nodded without hesitation. "He's evasive, I'm sure of it." Poirot's voice lowered, almost a whisper. "There is something else, my friend. You see, Thomas is not who he claims to be." I stared at him in confusion, my mind reeling at the implications. "What do you mean? Are you suggesting—" "Not suggesting," Poirot interrupted softly.
I am stating a fact. Our dear Thomas is an impostor." My mind swirled with disbelief, and I had to remind myself of Poirot's usual calm, even in the face of the most outrageous assertions. But this was something altogether different. What
could the butler possibly have to gain by assuming a false identity? And what could that mean for Sir Charles's murder? Poirot's next move left me speechless. He had already begun to piece together the butler's real identity. A former criminal, it turned out, whose past had been well hidden under layers of careful deception. But how had Poirot discovered this? The truth came not from the butler's own confession, but rather from the careful inspection of a letter from years ago, one that had been mistakenly placed in the same drawer as Sir Charles's journals. The handwriting matched that of a Nicolai, alias used by a notorious criminal in the past. The man in question had been involved in a series of high-profile heists before disappearing from the public eye. Poirot, with his typically meticulous approach, had also uncovered something even more unsettling. Thomas had once been a member of a notorious ring of thieves who specialized in numismatic heists. It seemed, according to Poirot, that Thomas had vanished after being caught up in a botched robbery involving rare coins. And then, just as quickly as he had disappeared, he had reappeared under the guise of a butler in Sir Charles's household, hiding his past with remarkable skill. "This man," Poirot murmured, his voice low, but filled with a certain gravity, "has a history that cannot be ignored. But what is his connection to Sir Charles? Why this disguise?" The question hung in the air as Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities. Could Thomas have killed Sir Charles to keep his past hidden? Could the two men have crossed paths in some way that triggered a fatal conflict? Or was this discovery merely another layer in a growing web of confusion? But even as Poirot's deductions seemed to close in on the butler, he stopped himself, ever cautious. "It is tempting, Hastings, to think that we have uncovered the final piece of the puzzle," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "But no, we must not leap to conclusions. This new revelation raises more questions than it answers. The question now is, why would Thomas, if indeed he is the man we think him to be, have chosen to conceal himself so well in this house?" I found myself nodding in agreement. The butler's disguise seemed so meticulously crafted that it raised more suspicion than it dispelled. And if Thomas truly was hiding something, it was clear that whatever it was, it had something to do with Sir Charles's death. Yet as Poirot had pointed out, the coin, the past mistake in Sir Charles's journal, remained an unresolved piece of the puzzle. What was it about the coin that was so significant? Was it something that Thomas, with his criminal past, would have recognized? Or was there a deeper, more personal connection that remained hidden beneath the surface? It was a moment that I would not soon forget. The weight of uncertainty, the feeling that the answer was just beyond our grasp. With every new revelation, the mystery deepened, and the list of suspects continued to grow. But the final piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Poirot remained silent, his eyes distant, as though his mind was already several steps ahead of us both. I had the sense that he knew more than he was letting on, but he wasn't ready to reveal it just yet. And so we were left once more in the grip of suspense, waiting for the next piece to fall into place. The game was far from over. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of unease, though nothing could prepare us for the sudden disappearance of Miss Eleanor, one of the younger members of the Middleton household staff. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, without a trace, leaving behind only a growing shadow of suspicion and the scent of something undeniably amiss. Her absence, I soon realized, was not merely a coincidence. It was the final crack in an already fragile facade. We had last seen Miss Eleanor just hours before her disappearance. I remembered her quiet, anxious demeanor during our brief conversation earlier that morning, her eyes darting nervously as if she were constantly searching for an escape. There had been nothing overtly alarming in her behavior, but I had noticed a tension in her that was difficult to place, an unease that matched, curiously, the growing strain in the house since Poirot's inquiries had begun. Poirot, for his part, had been uncharacteristically still that morning, poring over notes and papers, quietly running through the facts in his mind as he often did. He seemed, as always, to be one step ahead. But when word reached him about Miss Eleanor's disappearance, I saw a flicker of recognition cross his face. "Mon ami," he said, his voice calm but tinged with something deeper. "This is no coincidence. She is gone. But why?" The staff had begun to buzz with alarm, their whispers growing louder as each hour passed without any sign of Miss Eleanor. The most striking thing, Poirot pointed out, was how quickly she had disappeared. No one had seen her leave, and no one could recall her saying a word to anyone before she had gone. She had simply vanished. We began by questioning the remaining staff, but there was little new information to be found. Thomas, the butler, remained as evasive as ever, his face a mask of carefully controlled indifference. He denied knowing anything about Miss Eleanor's whereabouts, but Poirot had a sharp eye for reading the smallest of gestures. The butler's stiff posture and tightly pursed lips spoke volumes to Poirot's trained mind. But it was Miss Eleanor's behaviour during our interviews that now seemed to take on new significance. She had always been polite but distant, an assistant to Lady Margaret, whose duties were largely confined to overseeing the minor household affairs. However, on the day before her disappearance, I had observed her closely. Her responses during her brief conversation with Poirot were strangely vague, and more troubling still, she had failed to make eye contact for long periods, as though something weighed heavily on her conscience. Poirot, ever meticulous, began to connect the dots. As we delved into Miss Eleanor's history in the household, we learned something startling, something that, in hindsight, should have been more obvious than it had seemed at the time. Miss Eleanor had, unbeknownst to many, been involved in a secret, passionate relationship with Sir Charles. This new revelation struck me as odd. Eleanor, young and shy, seemed so inconspicuous in comparison to the grander personalities of the Middleton household, yet Poirot's gaze sharpened when he spoke of it. "You see, Hastings," Poirot said, tapping a pencil thoughtfully against his notebook, "there are hidden layers in this household, as always, and Miss Eleanor was not as simple as she appeared. She was a woman with a secret. Sir Charles had, I believe, been her lover." I was taken aback by the boldness of Poirot's deduction. There had been no previous hint of this, no indication that Miss Eleanor had ever been more than a quiet, proper servant. But Poirot's words, spoken with the certainty I had come to expect, slowly began to make sense as he unravelled further details of their relationship. Miss Eleanor's connection to Sir Charles, I learned, had been kept from most of the family, but not all. Lady Margaret, ever watchful and sharp-eyed, had suspected something for some time. Poirot had already picked up on Lady Margaret's subtle reactions during her earlier interviews, her silence, the way her fingers would briefly tighten into fists when the subject of Miss Eleanor was mentioned. Now, as he pushed further, it became clear that there had been a falling out between the two women, one that coincided with the days leading up to Sir Charles's death. Miss Eleanor, it seemed, had argued with Sir Charles the night before his
murder. The nature of the argument was unclear, but Poirot had gathered that it had been passionate, intense, and perhaps even threatening.
There was a great deal of uncertainty surrounding the specifics, but it was this confrontation that Poirot believed had led to Miss Eleanor's sudden disappearance. "She was frightened, Hastings," Poirot remarked quietly as he leafed through the evidence again. "Miss Eleanor is not merely a frightened girl. No, she was hiding something deeper, something that would explain both the argument with Sir Charles and her abrupt departure." I found myself struggling to form a clear picture
of Miss Eleanor in my mind. The more Poirot uncovered, the more I realized how little I truly knew about the people in this house.
It was as though every new piece of information peeled back another layer of falsehoods and secrets, and the world I had once thought I understood had started to crumble. Poirot turned to me then, his gaze intense. "And now we must ask why. Did she leave so suddenly? What is it that she fears?" The disappearance of Miss Eleanor cast a dark pall over the entire investigation. The net, which had already seemed to be drawing tighter, now stretched even further, with more questions than answers. Had Miss Eleanor killed Sir Charles out of jealousy or fear? Or was she, too, a victim in this labyrinth of lies? If she were indeed involved in his death, what did she have to hide? And could the same fears that had caused her to run have been connected to the deeper mystery of Sir Charles's murder? As Poirot and I pored over the evidence, I began to sense the delicate balance of tension shifting. The remaining suspects were growing more desperate, their nerves increasingly frayed. A sense of paranoia seemed to take hold. Even Thomas, usually so calm and collected, had begun to show signs of agitation. Something was coming to a head. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking from one piece of evidence to another,
his mind racing. We are close, Hastings. Very close indeed. And yet, as the tension in the house escalated, I could not shake the feeling that we were still in the dark.
One by one the pieces were falling into place, but they were not forming the picture we expected. At that moment, a faint sound echoed from the hall, followed by a hurried knock at the door. Poirot's gaze flickered toward me, his expression
unreadable. We both knew that the next turn of the investigation would be a crucial one.
And as the door opened, the figure who entered only deepened the mystery. The drawing-room was filled with an almost oppressive silence as the last of the Middleton family members, along with the remaining household staff, filed into the room. Miss Eleanor, who had disappeared only days before, had not returned, and her absence hung like a pall over the gathering. As Poirot stood by the fireplace, his posture composed yet commanding, I could sense the tension mounting in the room. I took my place beside him, watching as the eyes of the assembled group darted from one to another, each of them knowing that the moment had arrived. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, each suspect seemingly unaware of the storm that was about to break. "My friends," he began, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, "we have arrived at the final chapter of this affair, and it is time that I, Hercule Poirot, reveal to you the truth of Sir Charles Middleton's tragic death." The words echoed through the room, and a collective shift occurred. The tension, once buried beneath the surface, now broke free and coursed through the air like an electric current. Lady Margaret's eyes darted nervously, George Middleton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Thomas, the ever-stoic butler, remained as impassive as ever. Yet I could sense the undercurrent of fear and guilt that permeated their very beings. Poirot waited a beat, as though allowing the gravity of the situation to sink in. He then turned his gaze to the group and began his methodical recounting of the events, each word punctuated with the rhythm of his unerring logic. The murder, it seemed to us, had been driven by greed, a financial motive. An inheritance, perhaps, Poirot continued, his tone carefully neutral. But as I sifted through the evidence, I began to see a deeper, more personal layer to this case. The love of money, though strong, was not the true driving force. No, my friends, the cause of Sir Charles's death was something far more powerful, something rooted in jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately revenge. I could see their faces tighten at the mention of revenge, the very word hanging in the air. Like a heavy cloud, George Middleton's hand gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. Lady Margaret's lips trembled ever so slightly, and Thomas stood motionless, as though frozen in time. Poirot's eyes lingered on them all, calculating, piercing. I began my investigation with the assumption that Sir Charles had been killed. In a fit of rage, perhaps by one of his family members, Poirot continued, his tone smooth and precise. But no, this was not the case. The rage, the anger, these emotions did not arise from simple financial gain. They arose from a much deeper, more personal betrayal. He paused, letting the words settle in the room like a fine mist. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Poirot pointed to the empty space where Miss Eleanor should have been sitting. "It is Miss Eleanor, the young woman who has vanished, who holds the key to this mystery. She was not merely a servant in the Middleton household. No, she was someone far more entangled in the fabric of this family's secrets than anyone had realized." Gasps rippled through the room, and I could see the colour drain from Lady Margaret's face as Poirot's words began to take form. I could almost hear the unsaid questions filling the space around us. The butler's eyes flickered briefly as though considering whether to speak, but he remained silent. Poirot's voice cut through the tension, steady and unyielding. Miss Eleanor was, in fact, Sir Charles's lover. A secret she kept hidden for some time. And though no one in the house suspected the true depth of their relationship, it was one built on a foundation of lies, misunderstandings, and most crucially, betrayal. I could hear a collective intake of breath as the truth began to crystallize for the others, but Poirot did not stop there. He continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Miss Eleanor, it seems, discovered something terrible. Sir Charles had been using her, manipulating her emotions for his own amusement. He had promised her a future, yet that future was built on the most hollow of foundations. In a final, heart-wrenching act of cruelty, Sir Charles had been preparing to end their relationship and marry someone of greater social standing, someone, I suspect, who would have been able to secure his fortune far more effectively than Miss Eleanor
ever could."
A low murmur swept through the room, but Poirot remained composed, his attention fixed solely on the facts before him. "On the night before his death," Poirot continued, "Miss Eleanor and Sir Charles had a confrontation. She confronted him with the knowledge of his betrayal. In that moment, when the woman she loved turned his back on her, her fragile emotional state broke. The jealousy, the heartbreak, these were feelings that Sir Charles, in his arrogance, had failed to comprehend." I glanced over at Lady Margaret, whose face had gone ashen. Her hands were trembling, and I saw the faintest trace of something in her eyes, perhaps guilt, perhaps sorrow. But it was more than that. It was a fear that could no longer be hidden. Poirot's voice became even quieter, his words cutting through the heavy silence. In a fit of jealousy and despair, Miss Eleanor took a step no one could have anticipated. She murdered Sir Charles in a moment of blind rage, but she did not act alone. No, she had help, though not in the way you might think. The room was utterly still now. No one moved, not a single breath escaped. Poirot looked directly at Thomas, the butler. "You knew about the affair, didn't you, Thomas? You knew of Miss Eleanor's emotions, and you watched, silent as always, waiting for the right moment to act." I saw the slight shift in Thomas's expression, the smallest narrowing of his eyes. Poirot had struck at the heart of the matter. It was not that Miss Eleanor had murdered Sir Charles to inherit his wealth, Poirot said, his gaze never leaving Thomas. It was the act of revenge. The betrayal she suffered was far too great to ignore. But there was another factor, my friends.
A factor that only came to light through my investigation of Sir Charles's journals. Poirot leaned forward slightly, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Sir Charles had written about a coin, an old family heirloom that had
been in his possession for years. That coin was passed to Miss Eleanor in a moment of vulnerability, and it was that coin, my dear friends, that sealed his fate. Miss Eleanor had murdered Sir Charles not for money, not for love, but for revenge. The coin, an object of personal significance, had symbolized the years of emotional manipulation and betrayal she had endured. When Sir Charles discarded her for another woman, It was that coin that sparked the final, fatal confrontation. Poirot's gaze swept the room one final time. And so, it is with great certainty that I name the murderer Miss Eleanor. A chill ran through the room as Poirot's words settled over the gathered crowd. I glanced at the faces of those around us, each one pale, stunned, and still reeling from the revelation. No one had suspected Miss Eleanor, but as Poirot's deductions unfolded, the truth became undeniable, and in that moment I knew that Poirot had once again done what he did best, solved the case with the unparalleled clarity of his mind. The mystery was unraveled, and the truth, as always, had its own way of revealing itself, no matter how well hidden. The Middleton household was eerily quiet in the days that followed the revelation of Miss Eleanor's role in Sir Charles's
murder. The once thriving estate, filled with the hum of daily life and the rustling of family affairs, now seemed shrouded in a quiet, oppressive atmosphere. It was as though the very walls themselves mourned the tragedy that had unfolded within them.
Miss Eleanor, as Poirot had so definitively named her as the murderer, had been apprehended shortly after the grand denouement. The local authorities had taken her into custody, though I couldn't help but wonder if she understood the full weight of her actions. The desperate, heartbroken young woman who had so fiercely confronted Sir Charles had now been silenced, her fate sealed by her own fragile emotional state. Poirot, as always, seemed unmoved by the drama of it all. He remained, as he always did, calm and collected, his mind ever focused on the human motivations that lay beneath the surface. We had spent the last few hours in his study, going over the final details of the case. Poirot, as always, was meticulous, though there was a certain heaviness to his tone as he spoke. I watched him now, as he stood by the window, looking out at the garden beyond. The soft light of the late afternoon cast a warm glow across the room, but Poirot seemed unaffected by the tranquil scene. His eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed distant, as though his mind was still unravelling the complex emotions that had led to Miss Eleanor's crime. "You see, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice low but firm, "it is not the crime itself that I find most tragic. No, it is the emotions that led to it, the jealousy, the sense of betrayal, the crushing weight of a love turned bitter. That is what makes this case so utterly sorrowful." I nodded, understanding the depths of his reflection. For Poirot, the murder was always just the final manifestation of something deeper, something far more human. The emotions that clouded the hearts of the guilty were the true puzzle to be solved, not just the crime itself. The victim, Poirot continued, was not Sir Charles alone. No, the victim was Miss Eleanor as well. She was trapped in a web of her own emotions, manipulated by a man who never truly cared for her, and yet who held such power over her heart. She killed him not because she wished to be free of him, but because his betrayal destroyed the very foundation of her being. I watched as Poirot turned away from the window, his expression a mixture of sadness and quiet resignation. The satisfaction of solving the case, of bringing justice to Sir Charles, was there. But it was tempered by the knowledge that the real tragedy lay in the hearts of those involved. "And what of the others, Poirot?" I asked, my voice carrying the weight of my own thoughts. "What of the Middleton family? Will they ever be able to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives?" Poirot's eyes flickered, and for a moment there was a brief, almost imperceptible flash of sorrow in them. He had seen too many tragedies, too many broken lives, to have any illusions about the ease of recovery. but he answered, as always, with quiet wisdom. "The Middleton family will move forward, as families do," he said. "The world will go on, the estate will be managed, and life will continue. But something has been lost, Hastings. Something irreplaceable." He paused, as though considering his next words carefully. "It is not only the death of Sir Charles that has left a void, it is the erosion of trust, the corruption of love. When betrayal becomes so deep, when a wound is so raw, it is difficult, no, impossible, for the scar to ever fully heal." I looked at him, unable to find the words to respond. Poirot's reflections, though often profound, always carried with them an undeniable sadness. The intellectual triumph of solving the case, of uncovering the intricacies of the human heart, was
a victory, yes, but it came at the cost of so much more. The human heart, Hastings, Poirot continued, is a strange thing, so capable of great love and yet so vulnerable to jealousy, to fear, to bitterness.
Miss Eleanor did not kill Sir Charles because of a lack of love. No, her love was too strong, and that is what made her actions so tragic. I found myself nodding in agreement, though I could not fully grasp the depth of Poirot's understanding. He had seen so much, lived through so many cases, and yet he still seemed to carry the weight of the human condition with such grace, such quiet understanding. I glanced over at the mantelpiece, where the small, intricate objects that Poirot so often kept in his study seemed to catch the light in a way that made them appear almost alive. I knew that he would move on from this case, as he always did. He would file it away in the corners of his mind, perhaps reflecting on it again in the quiet moments that followed. But there was one thing I knew for certain. Poirot was not merely a solver of crimes. He was a student of the human soul, always striving to understand its complexities, its weaknesses, and its triumphs. And in this case, as in so many others, it was the human heart that had been the true culprit. I had always admired Poirot's intellect, but it was in these quiet moments, when he reflected on the deeper truths of life, that I found my awe for him deepen. His ability to see beyond the surface, to understand the forces that drove people to do terrible things, was unmatched. But it was his recognition of the inherent sadness of it all that made him so extraordinary. We will never truly understand.
Hastings, Poirot murmured, almost to himself. Why one heart breaks while another thrives, why one soul seeks vengeance while another seeks redemption. It is the nature of things, a question without an answer. He turned toward me, his
sharp eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. But perhaps in the end, it is not the answer we seek that matters most. It is the understanding, the recognition of our own flaws that will help us endure. That is the real victory, Hastings, and that, I believe, is the true nature of justice. As
he spoke, I felt a deep sense of closure wash over me. The case had been solved, the murderer brought to justice.
But Poirot's words lingered in the air, reminding me that there was more to life than simply solving mysteries. There was a deeper, more profound understanding of the world, and it was one that Poirot, in his quiet wisdom, had come to grasp. We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Outside, the last rays of the setting sun bathed the estate in a soft glow, and the world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something. For a moment, I thought I could almost hear the faint echoes of Sir Charles's life, his ambition, his mistakes, his love, whispering through the halls. But Poirot was right. The world would go on, life would continue, as it always does. The case was closed, and justice had been served. And yet, in the stillness of that moment, I felt the weight of it all, the cost of betrayal, the price of love lost, and I knew that it would linger in my heart for much longer than I had anticipated.